Tom and I wrote the book that you have, The Broken Branch, in 2006. By the way, it makes a great holiday gift and for any holiday that you can imagine. And we did an update and a second edition, which is the one that you have. As we looked at, after a period of serious dysfunction, that which had occurred, of course, with a Republican president and a Republican Congress, with a Democratic Congress taking over, we updated and said that there were some, I suppose you could call them green shoots out there, but only a few green shoots and a continuing sea of dysfunction. Now we have another couple of years under our belt, and I think if we did a new edition, it would have to be called, either using very bad grammar, the brokener branch, or the far more broken branch, as things have steadily, or maybe not so steadily, deteriorated. Of course, the problems that we highlighted in the broken branch weren't just ones that had developed in 2000, 2001, or carried through to that period around 2006. They had their roots much earlier, and for reasons, some of which we describe in the book, that go way back. When we first came to Washington, it was in the fall of 1969, and it was a very difficult and tense time. We had a Republican president facing a Democratic Congress. That Democratic Congress was at that point 15 years into what became, of course, 40 consecutive years of Democratic majorities in the House, 26 in the Senate. Even then, they were confident enough about their position that the Democrats in the majority basically came in believing that somewhere buried in the Federalist Papers was an essay suggesting that the Congress shall be in the control of the Democrats. It was just sort of almost a God-given phenomenon. And of course, the deep divisions back then, the most divisive, were over Vietnam, which was tearing the country apart and tearing Washington and Congress apart. But those were not partisan conflicts, by and large. And it was striking back then that among the strongest supporters, indeed the critical supporters for Richard Nixon and his continued prosecution of the war in Vietnam, were the key power players in the Democratic majority who ran committees from appropriations to armed services. And of course, they were Southern Democrats. We called them boll weevils at the time for that bug that infects cotton. And they made up about 40% of the membership of the Democratic Party. The Democratic majorities for that 40-year period were really based on a set of strange bedfellows. That core of Southern Democrats, because the South was almost uniformly Democratic at the time, almost all conservative, and the Democrats from the rest of the country, mostly liberals. We call them, we just had the Northern liberals. And what they had in common was they could call themselves Democrats and be in the majority and get power from it. Now, if you looked at opponents of the Vietnam War, there were a substantial number of liberal Republicans. We called them gypsy moths back then. They made up about a quarter of the Republican Party. They were concentrated in New England and the Mid-Atlantic region, and a lot on the West Coast, which had a strong, we didn't think of it in red and blue terms then, but it was a reddish tinge. You know, people like Mark Hatfield in Oregon, Tom Kuchel, a senator from California. And indeed, the major vehicle for trying to defund American participation in Vietnam was the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment. It was Mark Hatfield and George McGovern. But even as we were there through this, the winds of change were beginning to blow. The South was already transforming itself. A combination of what was perhaps a seminal moment in our political transformation, that moment in 1965 when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act and turned to his then aide, Harry McPherson, and said, this is going to cost Democrats the South for generations to come. That, along with a phenomenon that our late colleague Nelson Polsby wrote about in a quite interesting way, air conditioning. Of course, Often we think of it as air conditioning in terms of Washington became a livable city and it could go 12 months a year. But as important was the phenomenon that made the South a place where people could move and live 12 months a year. So all the snowbirds, elderly and otherwise, began to move down and transformed the region and combined, turned it into the solid Republican region, the most significant base of the Republican Party now. And at the same time, partly because of those migratory patterns and for other reasons, the Northeast, New England, and the West Coast became bastions of the Democrats. The parties transformed. The Southern conservative Democrats became a little bit more than a trace element. We call them blue dogs and not boll weevils anymore. We don't even think of a term for liberal Republicans except dinosaur, I suppose, because they've basically disappeared from the face, at least, of Washington's earth. And our parties gradually became more and more like parliamentary parties. Now, there are a lot of other reasons attached to that I won't get into, some of which we mentioned in the book, but all of it began to transform Washington. And then the other phenomenon that was most striking, that was there in 1969 when we arrived, and for a period thereafter that began to change, is we moved from having very distinct seasons of governing and campaigning. You'd go from a season of campaigning through a transition and then to something very different, governing. And, you know, as I've reflected on this often, campaigning is a zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. It's a war, and they use the metaphors of war. You need to destroy your opponent. We don't have compromises in campaigns and elections. We don't say, geez, that was so close, you serve for a year and then I'll serve for a year, or we'll split our votes. But governing is an additive process. And if there is a lot in the social science literature about minimum winning coalitions, that you try and create a coalition where you can prevail, but you want it to be as slender as possible because the broader you make it, the more you have to dilute what you're doing. That's not the way it works in the real world of politics. You want to get a broader coalition for the more expansive policy making that you do. And it is in part for one very important reason, which is part of human nature. Nobody likes to accept the certainty of short-term pain for the vague promise of a long-term benefit. I was actually reflecting on this a couple of months ago on a Sunday evening as I was preparing for my colonoscopy the next day. And going through what was an unpleasant experience because I was promised that it would have significant benefits. And we trust our gastroenterologists by and large. Although Tom and I have the same gastroenterologist, and the big problem is you go in for an exam and you spend a half an hour where he grills us about politics. So I feel like sending him a bill. And the same thing in the dentist chair. Now, it's much more challenging in public policy, where almost everything that you do involves some short-term pain, even if it's dislocation for people because you're changing their rhythms and you're promising something down the road. But we start with an inherent deep distrust of our politicians. This is nothing new. You could go back. Obviously, humor from the colonial period forward focused a lot on Congress. Up through Mark Twain saying there's no native criminal class in America except for Congress, and Will Rogers and all the rest of it. So if you're going to get Americans who don't start with members of Congress being authority figures, accepting short-term pain for the promise of long-term gain, it requires in general broad bipartisan leadership support. The late, great Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to make this case frequently, where he said, we do not do social policy of any significance without broad bipartisan leadership support. And we have done it a couple of times in recent years. One was the Medicare prescription drug bill, which we wrote about in great detail in The Broken Branch. That ended up taking hold in part because it didn't involve short-term pain for anybody. It was unpaid for, and we're now paying the price for that. It was long-term pain, for short-term gain because it gave a benefit to people without extracting any kind of a price. Then we had the Affordable Care Act, and that, of course, has, well, it passed. It passed because we've seen in the last couple of years that as we move towards parliamentary parties in a non-parliamentary system and a process which can't work for very long, we had brief moments where it did work. It worked because the Democrats uncharacteristically had enough unity in the majority and then had a brief, almost nanosecond in legislative history with 60 votes in the Senate to make it go through. But now, of course, it's in the courts. We've got repeal and replace. We've got half the political process that worked hard against it, trying to trash it and discredit it. And so at best, the implementation, which was never going to be easy because it does involve enormous dislocation for large numbers of people, becomes even more challenging when people don't accept the premise to start with. So that's how things were when we arrived, but what we saw even as we were there was that we were moving towards the permanent campaign. A process where there wasn't any season of governing, where the norms that existed when we arrived, that you didn't trash people on the other side too much because they were adversaries, not as in an election enemies, and an adversary one day becomes an ally the next. Nobody would think of going into another member's district and campaigning against them. When you went to meetings about policy, there were the policy staffers there. But I began to see by the mid-'70s the policy staffers were being supplanted by pollsters and campaign consultants. The pollsters and campaign consultants who, when we first arrived, would work on the campaigns and then they'd melt away. You wouldn't see them again for a year and a half. They'd go off and do other things, became ever-present, and began to dominate the process. Now fast forward to 1994, after that 40-year period where during most of that time there was never any question which party would be in the majority. And Newt Gingrich, after a 16-year campaign, came in 1978, and Tom and I in early 1979 began a little project at AEI where we took a group of freshmen from the class of '78 to come over for informal off-the-record dinners every couple of months to track them through their first term. It was an extraordinary group of people, and we chose pretty well. We had Newt Gingrich, Dick Cheney, Geraldine Ferraro, and several others from the class. And Newt, from the moment he arrived, this was his third try at getting to Congress, had a well-formed strategy for creating a Republican majority. It was to destroy the institution, to save it, basically. It was a belief that if they kept going on where elections were individualized, they couldn't beat the incumbents. They had to nationalize the election and get people so disgusted with Congress that they would say, anything has to be better than this. And it took him 16 years, but it worked. And in 1994, he took his tribe out of 40 years of wandering in the desert to the promised land of the majority. And it's ushered in an era that we are in the midst of now, where margins are close, where every election you can easily weave a scenario where the majority could shift or get close enough that the next time would be at the tipping point, and that raised the stakes. So you move from a long era where you have Democrats and Republicans often intermixed, a very substantial center with moderate and liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, most of the members congregated around the center, to moving towards parliamentary parties and with very, very different agendas, and then a situation where any little thing could make the difference between majority and minority. Working with people on the other side, it was no longer adversaries, it was the enemy, and sleeping with the enemy was a no-no. And that began to take hold, and you could see it very firmly and clearly even before Newt came in with the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, where the Republican approach, when Democrats swept in, took the White House after 12 years out of power there, and held all the reins of power. And Republicans said, you're on your own. We'll make this a parliamentary system. You've got the majority, you've got the votes, don't count on us for anything. And partly because Democrats were arrogant and fat in Congress, 38 consecutive years in the majority, presidents come and go, what difference does it make? Clinton struggled with that through 8 months before he could get his budget plan through, and in a humiliating fashion finally made it happen by one vote in each house despite these comfortable majorities. And then, of course, all the way through to the embarrassment of the health care plan, and then the backlash in 1994. And if we had, after that, with Gingrich becoming Speaker, this sharp confrontation a year later that's deja vu all over again now, a shutdown of the government, which, severe as the consequences are, is like a little pimple compared to the massive heart attack that a breach in the debt limit would cause. We had a similar kind of dynamic, but when we did shut down the government, it brought a backlash and a very different reaction. And a speaker at that point who still, because he had recruited so many of the new members who came in, 94 in that class, who still had enormous command, was able to go back to his troops and say, oops, we miscalculated. If we're going to win a second term in the majority, we're going to have to cooperate with this president. And then we had a year, almost of false hope of the two parties working together, and enormous accomplishments, from welfare reform to what became at least enough cooperation to move us towards a balanced budget and indeed a surplus. But it didn't last very long. And of course, before long, the permanent campaign and the ideological divisions took over. We had the impeachment process, and with impeachment, we lost, for example, an enormous opportunity. It was right there to get a bipartisan plan on Social Security that would have extended the system and at least removed one of the issues that's an obstacle to the long-term gain that just couldn't happen under those circumstances. Then we moved to the period that we discussed in so much greater detail in the broken branch. And now we are, where all of the pathologies have been exaggerated, and where we have seen a public grow increasingly disenchanted, and they were never enamored of Congress and the way things work in Washington. And one consequence has been that anybody who pops up and says, I'm not like those bozos there, we give extra credence to. And what we've been doing is gradually leaching out the politicians whose instinct is to protect their own institution, to create a set of rules that we call the regular order, to try and work together, to see the other side's point of view, to understand that you got a horse trade to make things happen. And keep in mind that our model politicians were the framers. They were politicians. They saw that you had to compromise. You compromised to get a constitution together. My late colleague Bob Goldwyn wrote a wonderful book about how James Madison, the politician, engineered the Bill of Rights to make it a part of the Constitution. We're losing those people, and we're ending up with those who are either consumed by pure ambition. We have a majority leader in the House who we've now resurrected his high school yearbook motto, I want what I want when I want it, which usually those mottos don't work very well, but this pretty much characterizes him, and those who are almost pure ideologues, who come knowing that they have the truth and that everybody in Washington who has preceded them has been transfixed by false visions of the world. And it has made policymaking much more difficult and added to the dysfunction. Now, we may navigate through this next couple of weeks. I think at least a sizable number of Republicans have been jolted suddenly by the reality that breaching the debt limit would bring catastrophic consequences. It's taken this long in part because of another dramatic change in our lives, which is Back to the Future, the development of partisan media, just as we had in the 19th century, but very different because of the enormous reach and depth and the immediacy, from talk radio to tweets and blogs and all the rest of it. But what that has done has been to create parallel universes, two sets of realities. People hear and read the same things over and over again. That's true for the members of Congress as it is for their constituents. And so we've had an alternative reality develop that says, breach the debt limit? That would be a great thing, because it'll finally convince the markets that we're serious about the revolution going on. Or others who said, well, great or not going to hurt at all, because all it means is we'll get the revenue coming in, we can pay our creditors, and we won't fund major parts of government. What's wrong with that? And that includes real opinion leaders like Tim Pawlenty and Senator Pat Toomey. And it's very hard when that's a reality that's being presented to get people to understand that it may be a false one. The last several days, the Republican leaders in Congress have brought in their heavy hitters. Paul Ryan has been met in front of his caucus to say, actually, this would really not be very good. And they brought in a major Treasury official from the Bush administration who's now at the Bipartisan Policy Center, who, along with the former staff director of the Senate Budget Committee under Pete Domenici, wrote a penetrating and exhaustive piece looking back at decades of the daily inflows of revenue and outflows of obligations to show what happens on August 3rd. And what happens is, that day, the federal government takes in $4 billion and has obligations of $10 billion. And it goes in a cascading fashion every day after that. So which of the $6 billion out of the $10 billion don't you pay? Do you not pay off the Chinese? Do you not pay off the Social Security recipients, or the troops with their salaries in the field, or the contractors sending the weapons and bullets over to Afghanistan and Iraq, or the meat inspectors and so on. So we may get something cobbled together out of this, but we continue to exist in an environment where any impetus to move towards compromise and bipartisan solutions to the major problems that we face, and they're not all just fiscal problems. And within those fiscal realities, the need to restrain spending and to come up with revenues. It's bizarre when you think that we have revenues now at 14.4% of GDP, the lowest level in 70 years, that you've got people repeating a mantra that's another part of this alternative reality. It's not a taxing problem, it's a spending problem. Well, just look at the demographics and then look at the revenues, and you can see that it is both. But within that, you have to decide not just what to cut, but how you're going to cut, so that you're not cutting investments in the future, so that you're not cutting things that, in fact, will mean that your economy will grow more slowly, or that you won't create a workforce that's capable of performing through the remainder of the century. Cut out women's, infants, and children's feeding programs, child nutrition. Cut out Head Start. Cut out all the funding for births, 2/3 of which in Texas and half in the country are under Medicaid. What kind of children are we going to have? What kind of development will there be when you look down the road and say, are we going to have an educated, prepared workforce to be able to compete in the country? So a lot of very tough decisions. You cannot make them without deliberation. You cannot make them without cooperation in a process not designed to operate in a parliamentary way. Now, I'd like to say things will get better in the near term. I'd like to say maybe we can limp through to the 2012 election, run on some of these issues, and have the American people decide. The fact is, for a variety of reasons, some structural, some political, and the fact that we're relatively evenly divided, we're not going to get a breakthrough in 2012. We're going to continue to operate with a permanent campaign in a pretty much parliamentary way, and if anything, we will see greater divisions. The remaining slender number of blue dogs, moderate and conservative Democrats, are the targets in the redistricting process, and the Republicans, where they're able to work their will in redistricting, are shoring up many of their own districts, making them a little bit more Republican, which means the primaries will matter even more, and that means they're pulled even further to the right. And we're now seeing that some of these Tea Party adherents who came in last time, who are starting to see that maybe it's a little more complicated than they thought, are being challenged by people who say, I'm not like those bozos. So brace yourselves for a long and difficult ride. And now Tom will provide the good news.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Tam. It's always a pleasure seeing the two of you and coming together with you all, with people who are out there teaching in the schools, trying to deliver the promise of our republic, which is something that many members of the public don't realize, that we have a republic. They think more in terms of small d democracy, instructions, principles, do what we want. It's a very different world, and that's something of what I want to talk to you about here today. Norm's pretty much covered our personal physiology, so I'm not gonna go any more into that. He really does have a wonderful op-ed in the Post this morning. It's a case against the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, appropriately on the day in which the House is voting on its cut cap and balance proposal. It's, for those of us who've been around too long, it's deja vu all over again. Whenever one runs into difficult policy dilemmas and political obstacles, one engages in sort of utopian thinking, which Karl Popper warned us about many decades ago, and revert to an idea of a rule that would somehow make us or our successors in legislative bodies do the right thing. It's a fool's quest, but we're going to have to at least go through the exercise again. I'm actually attracted to some constitutional amendments, one in particular that was suggested by Herb Stein at a similar period of economic difficulty. He was a renowned Republican economist, actually a colleague of Norm's at AEI, just a wonderfully intelligent and witty man. He suggested that we have a constitutional amendment to require school children to pray for a balanced budget, which, as best as I can tell, would work a hell of a lot better than the alternatives. Sitting at Brookings and in Washington, I face a dilemma during times like this that I think is very close to one that you face with your classes every day these years. You know, our job is to sort of get the story right, to try to be honest, faithful to the truth, reflect the history that leads up to it, try to give meaning to the constitutional language. And in doing that, we oftentimes feel the need to achieve a kind of balance. That is, the balance is seen as the test of whether one is fair-minded. But the problem is, if the reality doesn't reflect a balance, if the situation is not symmetrical and you insist on doing so, what you do is direct all of the anger and animus at an institution and miss entirely the underlying political and partisan dynamics that are at work. So right now, I find it difficult as someone who's worked for decades in this town on reform, among other things, happily working with Republicans and Democrats. I now face a situation where I don't see the symmetry. Yes, we have an ideological polarization of the parties. They're much more internally homogeneous, and if you will, the center of gravity of each party has moved further and further apart. But and that's been reflected over the last couple of decades. We talk about it in the Broken Branch, but it has taken a different form today. It's become really quite asymmetrical, and the sort of the nature, behavior, approach, membership of the Republican Party, I am sorry to say, but honestly say, is really quite different than that of the Democratic Party. The Democrats still have represented enough diverse districts that there's disagreements within it. It's also the case that their last two presidents have been in search of the median voter in the electorate and not just in their party. And so they've been willing to do deals and looking to do deals with the other side. But in this environment, it's almost impossible for deal-making to occur because it's seen as traitorous among activist Republicans in this country. And even the Rob Portmans, who was a superb member of the House, a cabinet member, now a member of the Senate, on smaller issues, sort of out of the public eye, engages in what's natural to him. But on the big issues, he signs on to the constitutional balanced budget amendment. You know, he is, because there is no freedom to really operate and still plausibly develop a career within the Congress as a Republican elected official. In fact, what distresses me, I think, more than anything else is a kind of willful ignorance that is perpetrated and that supplants any honest, fair-minded discussion within and between political parties and among politicians of, say, how we got to the mess. What is there an inexorable trend toward higher and higher government spending? I mean, it seems obvious, right? It is? No, it's not. If you look at the evidence, we've been spending about 18, 19% of GDP and taxing about that level for a whole long time. We balanced our budget at the end of the 1990s. You know, when I hear politicians say we're not overtaxed, we spend too much, well, yeah, it went up. Guess what? The spending went up because we hit the biggest economic disaster since the Great Depression. So the overall size of the economy shrank while spending did not shrink. It increased because of the counter-cyclical nature of all government's response to an economic decline to keep it from descending into depression. Now, for some members of the public, and most members of the public, you say, well, let's cut them some slack. They don't exactly spend most of their time reading about government and politics and policy and public affairs. They're busy. It's hard making ends meet these days to find work and keep their jobs and meet their budgets. It's really tough. But a kind of populism, in this case, a sort of angry right-wing populism has developed that has created a certainty, absolute certainty among members of the public that is utterly contrary to any kind of fair-minded, open, inquisitive assessment of the evidence facing us. And sadly, both the layer between government and the public, that is the media, the punditry, has tended to reinforce those beliefs. And the politicians themselves do it, and that is perhaps the saddest reality of all. If you really think about the talk, there are a lot of people now. One of the things that distinguishes Democrats and Republicans in the electorate is that Republicans believe it's important to stand by principles and not compromise. Well, that sounds like a good thing, but it's completely contrary to the whole design and structure of our constitutional system. We all knew that we would be a large, heterogeneous society with conflicting interests, and the idea was not to have a direct democracy with people simply governing themselves, but to have a republic in which elected officials representing diverse interests and views would come together and engage in good faith discussions, negotiations, bargaining, compromise. Sure, they had an ideology, a public philosophy, a party. They had a starting point, but in the end, sort of both the political realities and some policy realities would come to bear, and they would engage in that kind of give and take, which is what a legislative body permits. It's the great strength of our democratic system, properly the first branch of government. But that doesn't happen in the contemporary Congress now. It is the saddest thing for those of us who've been up there, who've worked there, who've studied it, who've written about it, and see that it just doesn't occur. There is no space for that anymore. The whole notion of a sort of Burkean, I owe you my judgment and not simply my vote, is gone. It is seen as traitorous. The pledges are signed, commitments made before entering the legislative arena. This goes completely against the whole design and structure of our system. And in some respects, I believe that's why we are in the problem that we are in. It's taken a new form and an uglier form. I was talking to a reporter, Jonathan Cohen, yesterday, actually by email. We do everything by email, hardly talk to anyone anymore. And he was working on this problem of appointments that have been made by the Obama administration, in some cases cabinet level, like the energy secretary, but also, of course, the head of the new financial consumer agency, the head of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Think of the Fed appointment, Peter Diamond, Nobel laureate. In so many cases now, these are opposed not on grounds of competence or ability, but sort of either just pure ideological opposition, but even more than that, it's the 21st century version of the 19th century nullification. It's, yeah, the Affordable Care Act passed. Well, we're not going to let it go into effect. We're going to starve it. I mean, repealing it would be something they could do. It's sort of legitimate, but we're going to use every means. We will not allow an appointment appointee to be confirmed for the critical positions. We will try to starve the appropriations in ways that will prevent a law passed by legitimately in the process to be implemented. Same thing with the financial reform. The arguments coming from Senate Republicans now is we will not confirm any director without President Obama promising to support an amendment to the financial reform that replaces the director with a multi-member commission. It's really quite extraordinary. It is a form of nullification, and the nullification takes on a broader meaning in our society right now, and that's a denial of the legitimacy of the opposition. I mean, it's in this case, I mean, Democrats have been awful tough on some Republican presidents, to be sure. Certainly George W. Bush over the war in Iraq. But it's come to the point now where we've had two Democratic presidents, both of whom come from the moderate wing of the party, both of whom have tried to reposition the party sort of close to the center, have embraced Republican ideas, you know, from health care to welfare reform, and yet both who sort of fundamentally are not accepted while in office as legitimate presidents. It comes now that for Obama to endorse a course of action is to diminish any chance of Republican support. It's one of the things that's constrained his leadership ability and why he's held back oftentimes, because all he has to do is support something and it's dead. It's history. Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think it's important to recognize what's going on, and we as teachers, and we're all teachers, have to figure out a way to deal with this, to be sort of faithful to the truth, to talk about the Constitution and its design. I mean, two things I would suggest that you insist on in your teachings, that we created a republic, not a democracy. A republic, representatives who assembled would refine and enlarge the public view, not simply reflect. The second point, it is we the people, not we the states. This was an effort to overcome the limitations of the Articles of Confederation. Governor Perry of Texas is not correct in his constitutional interpretation that it was the states that created the federal government. It was the set of individual people residing in those individual states that, in fact, did it. Now, let me just sort of make one final point to reinforce something Norm had said. If you had to characterize the environment in which our politics are playing out, it would be, one, the ideological polarization of the parties. Two, on top of that ideological difference is now a sort of strategic partisan team play in which enormous pressure is put on even moderates in parties to sort of stick with that party. And three, the permanent campaign in all of its manifestations in the legislative process. That has produced two very harmful effects within the Congress. It has led to an excess of majority rule in the House with the demise of regular order, and an excess of minority rights in the Senate. So just the opposite problems have occurred and has rendered this branch we love and revere even more broken than when our book was published. Thank you.